Oh, hey there. Holiday Biscotti. In order to make biscotti, we're going to need 1 pound of softened butter, about 8 cups of all-purpose flour, 6 ounces of almond flour. The recipe technically calls for 6 ounces of almonds chopped finely, but I've found that substituting almond flour saves time and effort. Originally, the recipe calls for dried cranberries. I prefer dried cherries, so that is my substitution in this recipe. So dried cherries, unsalted pistachios, oh, almost lost them, anise seed. That gives it that classic flavor. I think it's about 8 cups of sugar. Don't quote me on that. Might be like 6. I know it's 8 eggs. Some baking powder, vanilla extract, and then I have a chocolate variation where I leave out the cherries and the anise seed, and I substitute in a little bit of cocoa powder and chocolate chips. Today I have 2 kinds of semi-sweet. One is a 48%, the other is 55%. So that'll give a nice variation in the final deal. All right, let's get started. So I'm just going to dive in with the recipe here. If you need instructions on how to make this yourself, just look down in the show description and you'll see complete instructions for how to make both kinds of biscotti that I'm going to be making today. And so I'm just going to, in this video, start making the biscotti and you can follow along. Before we get too far, I do want to say that this recipe I got from a publication called Parade Magazine under the section Hometown Recipes, and it is from Pat Aldighieri. My version is a little bit different from her version, but she says, "This Italian cookie has become a favorite down to the smallest grandchild. I make them for everyone." And I've found this to be the case for my biscotti as well, that when I make it, it makes so much that I love giving it away, which is the perfect thing for this holiday season. And also, there's just an abundance of it around. While the butter whips up, I will get the sugar measured out, and once we have all the sugar measured out, I will add it to the butter, and then once that's combined, I'm going to add the eggs. And let's pause for a minute as we watch these eggs get whipped in to a fast-moving stand mixer. And while that mixes in, I'm going to measure out the anise seed and the vanilla extract and add them, as well as the baking powder. It is around here that the almond flour also goes in, and we should talk a little bit about the importance of using almond flour in this recipe, because without almond flour, the gluten strands in the flour, the wheat flour, would become so strong that you would be unable to eat this. It would be even harder and crispier. So the addition of the almond flour adds or breaks up or prevents the formation of longer gluten strands that when cooked would render the final product rock hard or even harder than it already is. Now here you can see me adding the wheat flour after adding in the almond flour and dividing up the sample, because if I were to try to do this all in one bowl, I found it can become too much for one stand mixer, and I'm using the larger 6-quart one here. Because there's so much flour and other material in the bowl, I find it useful to pulse the mixer while we're incorporating the flour, and then once that gets all incorporated so that we don't get any big puffs of flour spilling out of the mixer, we can run it faster just to get it to form into a cohesive dough like that. With the dough made, it's time to add the dried cherries and the pistachios because I have a special paddle attachment for my stand mixer that has little silicone pads on the outside. I can mix in these dry ingredients without risking tearing them to pieces by the paddle attachment, as long as I don't run it too long. Here's me doing a full batch of the chocolate, and you can see how close it is to spilling out over the sides. I put my hand up there just to catch anything. You can see how difficult it would be to get all these mix-ins added in when you have the bowl as full as it is. I also feel like the mixer really strains to mix when you have that quantity of material in there. I've already had one stand mixer go bad and need repairs because of the work that I put into it. I don't know if it was 100% from my practice of making biscotti, but it did happen. So this is my second stand mixer. Here you can see me splitting up the dough. I made 2 full doughs, one the anise seed with the cherries and pistachio, the other with chocolate. In forming the loaves, it needs to be 4 inches wide by 15 inches long. I have split it into fourths because it makes 4 loaves. So I've weighed out 1 loaf here, and now I'm going to shape it, which I will demonstrate here for you. I can get 2 loaves onto a cookie sheet like this, and I can get 2 cookie sheets like this into my oven, but I find it easiest just to work 2 loaves at a time rather than trying to get all 4 loaves in at once. While I might speed up the process, you do end up having to have room on your counter for all the loaves when they come out of the oven. They're all cooling at the same time, and then you got to cook them all at the same time and get them all back in the oven. I find it easier to stagger the cooking time so that I can have some loaves in while I'm working on other loaves, shaping other loaves, and then I can also be cutting some. So I try not to get all the loaves in the oven at the exact same time. You might notice here that the dough looks a little tough, a little solid. That's because I do like to put it in the refrigerator or the freezer to cool down after mixing. It makes it much easier to form. So this here is an important step in biscotti making. They've been in the oven for about 15 minutes. They need about another half hour, but the instructions from Pat Aldighieri caution that the biscotti loaves might spread a little bit. If this does happen, just take a metal spatula like I have here and press in the sides a little bit, and it should keep them from spreading more. Botany Minute. Almonds, while fitting the culinary description of a nut, do not fit the botanical definition of a nut in that they are not housed inside of a woody, indehiscent pericarp. While that might be complete gibberish to you, what is important to know is that, botanically speaking, almonds are drupes. A drupe consists of a thin but tough exocarp, a fleshy mesocarp, and a stony endocarp that surrounds a single seed. Now, by the time unshelled almonds arrive at the store, the exocarp and mesocarp have been discarded, leaving us with something we might assume to be a true nut. In reality, almonds growing on trees resemble unripe peaches in that they appear small, green, and furry. In fact, peaches and almonds are quite closely related, as are cherries, plums, apricots, and nectarines. Interestingly, some wild species of almonds are quite poisonous, which poses the question, how did our ancestors determine which almonds were safe to cultivate and eat? So the loaves are cooked and fresh out of the oven, which means they have to cool. This usually only takes about 5 to 10 minutes. Cutting them while they're still a little warm, I find, is easier than cutting them when they're very cool. Once they are cool, though, our work is not finished, for they have to be cut up. I like to use a chef's knife for this with a straight edge, not a serrated knife. I will show you here what happens when you try to cut it with a serrated knife. I find that it has a tendency to tear, and those ends, the little shoulders on the biscotti, have a tendency to fall off if you're not careful. So I like to do a single solid straight down motion with a flat bladed knife with a clean edge. I find that it does a lot better of a job of making sure you don't lose any pieces of biscotti as you're cutting, because it can be quite fragile at this point before you bake it a second time. And once you get these all cut up, you can get them back on the cookie sheet, and they'll go back in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes aside. You have to keep an eye on them that they don't get too dark while they're baking. All right, so right here is what happens when you don't use the right knife. I have a serrated sort of bread style knife here, and as I start cutting it, as I slide the knife down, it really just kind of tears and you don't get solid pieces of biscotti. It's really easy to break the biscotti at this point, and it just sort of turns into little pieces if you're not using a good knife. Now watch me switch back to this heavy straight edge knife, and I can slide through each piece quite easily and they stay intact. One of the best things about this recipe is how much it makes. I've only made about a quarter of the 2 batches that I've prepared, so I'll have lots more dough that I can make and give out to people. I generally got into the habit of making this about twice a year, once at the end of the fall semester and once at the end of the spring semester at school. And I would bring it into school in large Ziploc bags. And I would lay it out on the table in our office area, and people would be able to come in and grab biscotti throughout the day. And then when that bag was empty, they'd think, oh, all the biscotti's gone. I guess I'll just have to get back to work or something. And then I would go back into my office and pull out another bag of biscotti, and I would just keep on doing that. And they would always think like, okay, this is finally the last of the biscotti. And I would still be pulling out additional bags of biscotti, which was a great pleasure for me to be able to continuously surprise them with more biscotti. Here you can see me flipping the biscottis as they're halfway through their baking process. You can use a pair of tongs, but I find it easier just to use your hands as long as you can tolerate the heat. Science Corner. While domesticated almonds are generally considered safe to eat, they still produce a toxic cyanoglycoside called amygdalin in their nectar and pollen. While the amount of amygdalin in the nectar is not considered toxic to bees, which are necessary to pollinate the plants, the almond trees can still produce enough amygdalin in their pollen to pose a significant hazard to the bees which feed upon it, especially if the bees are feeding solely upon that pollen as a source. Archaeology alert! Asuti et al. In 2018 used charcoal remains from an archaeological site in Greece to determine plant use and environmental change from about 38,000 to 6,000 years ago. Almond was abundantly present at the site, not as nutshells but as burned wood, suggesting an environment dense with almond trees, which could be used for heat and as cooking fuel. While almond shell fragments do eventually show up in the archaeological record at the site, it is difficult to tell for certain whether they were there as a byproduct of the fuel burning or as part of the diet of the people living there. Regardless, today we can all enjoy almonds in our biscotti, so let's get back to our baking. So I got a small confession here. For my first ever guest appearance on the show, I accidentally had the camera in the wrong setting, so there is no audio. So I'm going to have to approximate our conversation. Hi, Mr. Guerra. It's certainly nice to have you here today on Dr. Beck's Epicurean Delights as my first guest ever. This is a wonderful pleasure for me to have you here. Thank you. Have you ever had biscotti before? No, I've never had it. It sure looks good, though. Yes, it does. You're familiar with biscotti, though? Yes, I am. All right, well, should we have a taste now? All right, well, allow me to serve you. I will give you one of each flavor so that you can compare the two. Here is a chocolate one, and here is the anise flavored one with the dried cherries and pistachios. And I will grab a piece for myself. This looks very tasty. Here we go. Crunch. Crunch, 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 crunch. Well, what do you think? It's very good. It's quite crunchy. Yes. It's really good for dipping into hot chocolate, or I've heard coffee is great paired with biscotti. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming here to be my first guest on Dr. Beck's Epicurean Delights. Anything for my favorite son-in-law. I mean, you're way better than coal. Well, that's certainly so nice of you to say. I hope that you can guest again on Dr. Beck's Epicurean Delights very soon. Well, That's all for this episode. I'll catch you guys next time on Dr. Beck's Epicurean Delights. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.